Welcome to The Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, a presentation of the Cato University, a project of the Cato Institute. The Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson was written by George H. Smith and narrated by Craig Deichmann. The quotations are read by Bill Middleton. This recording of the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson was produced by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated.
Thomas Jefferson still survives. These were the last words of John Adams. Adams died in 1826, on the 4th of July. John Adams didn't know it, but Thomas Jefferson had already died 5 hours earlier. An 83-year-old Jefferson had awakened during the night. "Is it the 4th?" he asked. Yes, he was told. Jefferson went back to sleep and quietly passed away. John Adams was the second President of the United States and an architect of American independence. Thomas Jefferson was the third President of the United States and author of the Declaration of Independence. The nearly simultaneous deaths of Adams and Jefferson made this an extraordinary 4th of July, but additional details made it even more significant. July 4th, 1826, was the 50th anniversary of American independence. 10 days before his death, Thomas Jefferson was invited to attend festivities in Washington, D.C. His response, declining because of illness, was his last letter. It contains Jefferson's final thoughts on the Declaration of Independence.
May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. That form which we have substituted restores the free right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are the grounds of hope for others. For ourselves, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them.
Although the Declaration of Independence is quite brief, it is packed with philosophy and history. The Declaration has cast its spell over generations of Americans, not primarily because of its relation to independence, but because of its philosophical value. It captures the thinking of an age, of a country, with a concise elegance which has rarely, if ever, been surpassed in American letters. The Declaration was written by the right man, Thomas Jefferson, in the right place, colonial America, at the right time, during a Revolutionary War. Change any of these conditions, and the Declaration we know would not exist. Its replacement would surely pale by comparison. This presentation explores the historical and philosophical background of the Declaration. It is divided into 3 sections. The first part clarifies some commonly misunderstood features of the Declaration and ends with a reading of the entire text. The second part traces the early life of Thomas Jefferson, examines how he came to write the Declaration, and offers some examples of how the Declaration as Jefferson wrote it differs from the Declaration we know today. The third and final part explores the philosophy of the Declaration, especially its defense of the right of revolution against an oppressive government. Most significant events in human history are plagued by differences of interpretation. The Declaration is no exception. Historians argue among themselves over vital points, and it is doubtful whether these controversies will ever be settled to everyone's satisfaction. To minimize the problems of interpretation, we have allowed participants to speak for themselves wherever possible. The Declaration was not a piece of old parchment to these founding fathers. It was literally an issue of life and death. The signers of the Declaration knew they faced charges of treason, punishable by death if they lost the war with England. When these signers pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to the cause of American independence, they were doing far more than paying lip service to a noble sentiment. It may surprise you to learn that there is no document actually entitled the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote the original rough draft, and he called it a Declaration of the Representatives of the United States of America in General Congress Assembled. After being edited in committee, Jefferson's draft was debated and edited by the Continental Congress on July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. The edited document was formally adopted on July 4th, 1776. Congress later ordered the Declaration to be engrossed on parchment. This version, signed on August 2nd, carries the title The Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. Most reprints of the Declaration are based on the parchment copy. Strictly speaking, the so-called Declaration of Independence did not declare independence. Rather, it stated the reasons and justifications for a formal separation from Britain, which had already occurred. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, rose in the Continental Congress and made the following resolution.
Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved.
Lee's resolution, a formal Declaration of Independence, was passed on July 2nd, 1776. This was the day that John Adams, writing to his wife Abigail, predicted would become a day of celebration for Americans.
The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore.
If independence was declared on July 2nd, why do Americans commemorate independence on July 4th? The edited version of Jefferson's Declaration was adopted on this day. This much historians agree on. But the 4th of July is also believed by many Americans to be the day on which the Declaration was first signed by delegates to the Continental Congress. Here we fall into murky controversy where historians disagree. Many historians reject a 4th of July signing, relegating this story to one of the myths of American history. The only signing by delegates, they say, took place on August 2nd, when the parchment version was signed. So, who said the Declaration was signed on the 4th of July? Thomas Jefferson, for one. In later life, Jefferson recalled a 4th of July signing, and he produced as evidence notes which he said were written virtually as the events occurred. John Adams also recalled a signing on July 4th. The testimony of these eyewitnesses might seem conclusive, were it not for some troublesome details. No congressional record mentions this signing. No signed copy dated on the 4th has ever been found, and no contemporary letters from other delegates mention this signing. These are some reasons why historians question the account of Jefferson and Adams, dismissing it as the faulty recollections of two old men. The possibility of a July 4th signing was rehabilitated by the distinguished scholar Julian Boyd, editor of the massive Princeton edition of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson. Professor Boyd evaluated the various arguments against a 4th of July signing and found them either faulty or inconclusive. It appears the jury deciding this controversy may remain out indefinitely. In reading the Declaration, We shall divide it into 5 parts. The first part articulates the obligation felt by congressional delegates to justify their separation from Britain.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
The second part summarizes the moral and political ideas used to justify independence and the American Revolution. This elegant summary is the most important part of the Declaration.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
The third part of the Declaration is the longest by far. It lists colonial grievances against George III, King of Great Britain. The real significance here lies not in the accusations themselves, but in their target. They are aimed at the English king instead of at the English Parliament. Why is this important? Because according to the political theory of the Declaration, severing ties with the mother country was warranted only if the king defaulted on the obligation to protect his subjects. The Declaration says of the king,
"He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislature. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures, and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
The fourth part of the Declaration expresses disappointment in the failure of the English people to support the American cause.
Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends.
The fifth and final part of the Declaration asserts the political sovereignty of the United States of America. Notice how it incorporates Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence, which we quoted earlier.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do, and for the support of the Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
By dividing the Declaration into 5 parts, we can see how it progresses step by step. The first part states the reason for writing a declaration. The second part summarizes the philosophy behind the Declaration. And the third part mounts an offensive against George III by citing the accumulated grievances of many years. With its theoretical and factual case complete at this point, the Declaration winds down to its conclusion. The fourth part expresses regret that Americans have not been supported by their English cousins, and the fifth part asserts the political sovereignty of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743 in Goochland, or what is now known as Albemarle County, Virginia. His father, a surveyor and explorer, married into the wealthy Randolph family and left Jefferson a large inheritance in land and slaves. When Jefferson married Martha Skelton in 1772, her dowry consisted of thousands of acres of land and over 130 slaves. By the time Jefferson wrote the Declaration, he was one of Virginia's wealthiest citizens and a major slaveholder. It is jarring to realize that the author of the Declaration of Independence, a magnificent tribute to individual liberty, was also hip-deep in slaveholding, the repudiation of all that liberty stands for. This inconsistency, some would call it hypocrisy, was not lost on Jefferson or on the many other founding fathers such as George Washington, who also owned slaves. Fully 1/3 of the signers of the Declaration were slave owners. An anti-slavery Quaker took a well-deserved swipe at this state of affairs.
When men talk of liberty, they mean their own liberty, and seldom suffer their thoughts on that part to stray to their neighbor.
It is an irony of history that Jefferson, a major participant in slaveholding, was a virulent critic of slavery, calling it a hideous evil and calling for its eventual abolition. But Jefferson also believed that America would suffer upheaval if thousands of slaves were released into American society.
We have a wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other.
A defender of Jefferson might point out that the manumission or liberating of slaves was illegal in Jefferson's time, and that Jefferson did try to legalize manumission when he served in the Virginia legislature. In addition, after writing the Declaration, Jefferson drafted a constitution for Virginia in which he called for the gradual eradication of slavery in his native state. A critic of Jefferson, however, might point out that Jefferson did not hesitate to advertise for the recapture of a runaway slave, and that his magnificent estate at Monticello, a work of many years, was built with the labor of slaves. Ultimately, there is little we can do to erase the blemish of slaveholding from the record of Thomas Jefferson. We must live with it, as we hope Jefferson did, uncomfortably. After graduating from the College of William and Mary in 1762, Jefferson studied law and was admitted to the bar in 1767. His interests, like his reading, were varied and intense. Jefferson's keen mind traversed over philosophy, law, architecture, history, music. The list is quite astonishing. Perhaps more than any other American of his day, Thomas Jefferson was a model of the 18th century Enlightenment. Jefferson served in the Virginia legislature for 6 years, beginning in 1769. In 1774, he wrote a summary view of the rights of British America, which proved to be second in importance only to the Declaration among his political writings. This pamphlet is useful in understanding the evolution of Jefferson's ideas. By 1774, many Americans supported resistance to parliamentary measures they considered unjust, but few Americans, especially in Virginia, denied outright the authority of the English Parliament to rule over America. Jefferson was among those few.
One free and independent legislature hereby takes upon itself to suspend the powers of another, free and independent as itself, thus exhibiting a phenomenon unknown in nature, the creator and creature of its own power. Not only the principles of common sense, but the common feelings of human nature must be surrendered up before His Majesty's subjects here can be persuaded to believe that they hold their political existence at the will of a British Parliament. Shall these governments be dissolved, their property annihilated, and their people reduced to a state of nature, at the imperious breath of a body of men whom they never saw, in whom they never confided, and over whom they have no powers of punishment or removal, let their crimes against the American public be ever so great? Can any one reason be assigned why 160,000 electors in the island of Great Britain should give law to 4 millions in the states of America, every individual of whom is equal to every individual of them in virtue, in understanding, and in bodily strength? Were this to be admitted, instead of being a free people, as we have hitherto supposed and mean to continue ourselves, we should suddenly be found the slaves not of one, but of 160,000 tyrants, distinguished too from all others by this singular circumstance, that they are removed from the reach of fear, the only restraining motive which may hold the hand of a tyrant.
This early pamphlet by Jefferson advances the theory that Americans owe allegiance to the king, not to the Parliament. America and England stand as independent bodies under the authority of George III. This is one reason why Jefferson did not concern himself in the Declaration with allegations against Parliament. America, he believed, was and always had been independent of Parliament. True independence meant renouncing allegiance to the king. Crucial arguments in a summary view re-emerge in the Declaration, sometimes with similar wording. Especially important are its allegations against George III, which closely resemble the Declaration. In 1775, Thomas Jefferson was sent by the Virginia Convention to the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. After Richard Henry Lee presented the resolution for independence, Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a declaration. The committee members represented various sections of the country. Thomas Jefferson was from the South. John Adams and Roger Sherman were from New England. Benjamin Franklin and Robert Livingston, an opponent of independence, were from the Middle Colonies. It was logical that Jefferson would be the penman of the Declaration. He received the most votes to sit on the committee, and, since a Virginian made the resolution for independence, it was considered appropriate that a Virginian should write it. John Adams approached Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration. Both men wrote accounts of this historic meeting many years after the event, and not surprisingly, the accounts do not entirely agree. Here is what John Adams had to say.
Mr. Jefferson came into Congress in June 1775 and brought with him a reputation for literature, science, and a happy talent of composition. Writings of his were handed about, remarkable for the peculiar felicity of expression. Though a silent member in Congress, he was so prompt, frank, explicit, and decisive upon committees and in conversation, not even Samuel Adams was more so, that he soon seized upon my heart. And upon this occasion I gave him my vote, and did all in my power to procure the votes of others. I think he had one more vote than any other, and that placed him at the head of the committee. I had the next highest number, and that placed me the second. The committee met, discussed the subject, and they appointed Mr. Jefferson and me to make the draft. I suppose because we were the first two on the list. The subcommittee met. Jefferson proposed to me to make the draft. I said, "I will not." "You should do it." "Oh, no." "Why will you not? You ought to do it." "I will not." "Why?" "Reason enough." "What can be your reasons?" "Reason first. You are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can." "Well," said Jefferson, "if you are decided, I will do as well as I can." A meeting we accordingly had and conned the paper over. I was delighted with its high tone and the flights of oratory with which it abounded, especially that concerning Negro slavery, which, though I knew his Southern brethren would never suffer to pass in Congress, I certainly never would oppose. There were other expressions which I would not have inserted if I had drawn it up, particularly that which called the king tyrant. I thought this too personal, for I never believed George to be a tyrant in disposition and in nature. I always believed him to be deceived by his courtiers on both sides of the Atlantic, and, in his official capacity, only cruel. I thought the expression too passionate and too much like scolding for so grave and solemn a document. But as Franklin and Sherman were to inspect it afterwards, I thought it would not become me to strike it out. I consented to report it, and do not now remember that I made or suggested a single alteration. We reported it to the Committee of Five. It was read, and I do not remember that Franklin or Sherman criticized anything. We were all in haste. Congress was impatient, and the instrument was reported, as I believe, in Jefferson's handwriting as he first drew it. Congress cut off about a quarter of it, as I expected they would, but they obliterated some of the best of it, and left all that was exceptionable, if anything in it was. There is not an idea in it but what had been hackneyed in Congress for 2 years before. The substance of it is contained in the Declaration of Rights and the violation of those rights in the Journals of Congress in 1774. Indeed, the essence of it is contained in a pamphlet voted and printed by the town of Boston before the first Congress met, composed by James Otis, as I suppose in one of his lucid intervals, and pruned and polished by Samuel Adams.
Thomas Jefferson, not pleased with the recollections of John Adams, had this to say.
The Committee of Five met. No such thing as a subcommittee was proposed, but they unanimously pressed on myself alone to undertake the draft. I consented. I drew it. But before I reported it to the committee, I communicated it separately to Dr. Franklin and Mr. Adams, requesting their corrections, because they were the two members of whose judgments and amendments I wished most to have the benefit before presenting it to the committee. Their alterations were 2 or 3 only, and merely verbal. I then wrote a fair copy, reported it to the committee, and from them, unaltered, to Congress. This personal communication and consultation with Mr. Adams he has misremembered into the actings of a subcommittee. Pickering's observations, and Mr. Adams' in addition, that it contained no new ideas, that it is a commonplace compilation, its sentiments hackneyed in Congress for 2 years before, and its essence contained in Otis's pamphlet, may all be true. Of that I am not to be the judge. Richard Henry Lee charged it as copied from Locke's treatise on government. Otis' pamphlet I never saw, and whether I had gathered my ideas from reading or reflection I do not know. I only know that I turned to neither book nor pamphlet while writing it. I did not consider it as any part of my charge to invent new ideas altogether, and to offer no sentiment which had ever been expressed before. Whether also the sentiments of independence and the reasons for declaring it, which make so great a portion of the instrument, had been hackneyed in Congress for 2 years before the 4th of July, 76, or this dictum also of Mr. Adams be another slip of memory, let history say.
After Jefferson wrote the rough draft, he, along with Adams and Franklin, made some revisions. The Declaration then moved to the floor of Congress for debate, during which additional revisions and substantial deletions were made. All in all, Jefferson's Declaration was subjected to 86 alterations. It also saw a quarter of its text excised by Congress. Among the revisions of Jefferson's original rough draft, the most interesting occurred in this famous line: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Here is how Jefferson originally wrote this line.
We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
The most substantial deletion by Congress was of Jefferson's polemic blaming George III for the slave trade in America. Here is the passage that never made it into the Declaration we know today.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise up in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another.
The deletion of this passage on the slave trade angered Jefferson, and he was displeased by some other alterations as well. As the 33-year-old Jefferson simmered, watching Congress cut and paste his treasured document, Benjamin Franklin, elder statesman of the Continental Congress, tried to console his colleague with his story.
I have made it a rule, whenever in my power, to avoid becoming a draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body. I took my lesson from an incident which I will relate to you. When I was a journeyman printer, one of my companions, an apprentice hatter, having served out his time, was about to open shop for himself. His first concern was to have a handsome signboard with the proper inscription. He composed it in these words: John Thompson, hatter, makes and sells hats for ready money, with a figure of a hat subjoined. But he thought he would submit it to his friends for their amendments. The first he showed it to thought the word hatter tautologous, because followed by the words makes hats, which show he was a hatter. It was struck out. The next observed that the word makes might as well be omitted, because the customers would not care who made the hats. If good, and to their mind, they would buy by whomever made. He struck it out. A third said he thought the words for ready money were useless, as it was not the custom of the place to sell on credit. Everyone who purchased expected to pay. They were parted with, and the inscription now stood, John Thompson sells hats. Sells hats, says his next friend. Why, nobody will expect you to give them away. What then is the use of that word? It was stricken out, the rather as there was one painted on the board. So his inscription was reduced ultimately to John Thompson, with the figure of a hat subjoined.
Thus did a seasoned politician named Ben Franklin soothe the ruffled feelings of a young and sensitive author named Thomas Jefferson. When we think of the Declaration today, we usually associate it with its famous second paragraph. This is where the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are mentioned, and where the right to abolish a tyrannical government is defended. If we find any section of the Declaration rather tedious, it is likely the list of grievances. This at least is the attitude of someone living in this century. But this was not an attitude typical of someone living during the late 18th century. This person would probably have viewed the list of grievances as the Declaration's most important part, and far more interesting than the second paragraph. If you were an American living in Jefferson's time, the ideas expressed in the second part would have been well known to you. They would have been part of your intellectual culture. Jefferson said these ideas were shared by most of his fellow countrymen. This is why a lengthy defense was unnecessary. The philosophy of the Declaration was accepted by many Americans who opposed independence. The main dispute between defenders and opponents of American independence was not over philosophy. Even the right of revolution against a tyrannical government was upheld by many foes of independence, or loyalists, as they were called. The real bone of contention between revolutionaries and loyalists was whether the relationship between Britain and America had deteriorated far enough to justify revolution. Revolution, Americans agreed, was a last resort. It was warranted only if all other means had failed, and only if no reasonable chance for a peaceful resolution was left. Revolution, in other words, was the last stop of self-defense. The Declaration concedes these requirements. It refers to the patient sufferance of these colonies and to the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. Note the word constrains. Jefferson used words carefully, and nowhere was he more careful than in his choice of this word. Americans were constrained to declare independence. They were compelled by the aggression of England. In every stage of these oppressions, the Declaration says, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. Jefferson portrayed Americans as long-suffering victims of an oppressive king. Indeed, it was widely argued that the king, by defaulting on the duty to protect his subjects, had already made America independent. Jefferson, in his notes of proceedings in the Continental Congress, reported the frequent occurrence of this argument among proponents of independence.
It was urged by J. Adams, Lee, Wythe, and others that the question was not whether, by a Declaration of Independence, we should make ourselves what we are not, but whether we should declare a fact which already exists. That, as to the king, we had been bound to him by allegiance, but that this bond was now dissolved by his assent to the late Act of Parliament, by which he declares us out of his protection, and by his levying war on us, a fact which had long ago proved us out of his protection, it being a certain position in law that allegiance and protection are reciprocal, the one ceasing when the other is withdrawn. No delegates, then, can be denied or ever want a power of declaring an existent truth.
It is important to understand that there were people of goodwill among both revolutionaries and loyalists. There were also scoundrels on both sides of the fence. How we view our forefathers is influenced by the accidents of history. If England had won the war, and given some better decisions, there's no reason why the most powerful military force in the world could not have defeated America, then our school books might read much differently than they do now. Benedict Arnold might be celebrated as the savior of his country, and George Washington might be condemned as a villainous traitor. Because both revolutionaries and loyalists shared a similar philosophy, the Declaration devotes its firepower to factual considerations. Those Americans uncommitted to independence did not need to be lectured on natural rights and the proper function of government. They probably agreed with the revolutionaries on these points already. But fence-sitters and loyalists did need to be persuaded that the time had come when revolution was absolutely necessary to preserve liberty. Consider the interesting case of a New York loyalist, Peter Van Schaack. In January 1776, Van Schaack secluded himself for an extended period of study. He read or reread the political works admired by 18th-century Americans in a tormented effort to determine where his loyalty should lie in the coming storm with England. Van Schack's basic philosophy was indistinguishable from pro-independence radicals. He too believed in a right of revolution, and he too denied parliamentary sovereignty. But Van Schaack was not convinced that the aggressions of the mother country added up to a conspiracy. He, unlike Jefferson, did not believe there existed a definite plan to enslave America. Therefore, Peter Van Schaack could not side with the revolutionaries, however much he agreed with their ideology.
My difficulty arises from this, that taking the whole of the acts complained of together, they do not, I think, manifest a system of slavery, but may fairly be imputed to human frailty and the difficulty of the subject. Most of them seem to have sprung out of particular occasions and are unconnected with each other. In short, I think those acts may have been passed without a preconcerted plan of enslaving us, and it appears to me that the more favorable construction ought ever to be put on the conduct of our rulers. I cannot, therefore, think the government dissolved.
Peter Van Schaack tried to remain neutral during the war with England, but to no avail. The state of New York enforced compulsory loyalty oaths, but Van Schaack, following his conscience, could not comply. He was banished to England in 1778 and did not return to America for 7 years. Peter van Schaack and many other loyalists were on the wrong side of the war. They suffered, not because they differed with the revolutionaries over theory, but because they differed with the revolutionaries over facts. For these people, the grievances listed in the Declaration easily constituted its most significant part. That was the 18th century's perspective. But here we are, 200 years later, looking back on the lost world of Thomas Jefferson. The thinking behind the Declaration is no longer so obvious to us. We need to understand the mindset of remarkable Americans like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others. We want to know the values and ideas which motivated them to revolt against a mighty imperial power. This is why the ideas contained in the second paragraph receive more attention today than the list of grievances. The second paragraph, probably the most famous paragraph in the history of American literature, allows us to peer into the minds of the Founding Fathers. When it came to political theory, Thomas Jefferson was one of the best-read delegates at the Second Continental Congress. This is part of the reason he was chosen to write the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson freely acknowledged the writers who influenced him, and many of these fall into what he called the Whig tradition. Whig, as you may know, was the name of a political party in England. But this is not what Jefferson meant by Whig. He meant not a party, but a political tradition originating in England around the 1640s. This decade saw growing opposition to absolute monarchy, leading to the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I in 1649, and the establishment of a short-lived Commonwealth. Jefferson subscribed to the basic principles of this tradition, including natural rights, social contract, the right of revolution, and a separation of governmental powers. These ideas were refined by English writers during the 1680s, and they became especially popular after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which displaced the Stuart dynasty from the throne of England. The premier writer in this tradition was John Locke, who wrote his famous Second Treatise of Government during the 1680s. Another hero to Jefferson was Algernon Sidney, whose book Discourses Concerning Government was regarded by many Americans as a textbook of revolution. Sidney was called Sidney the Martyr because he died on the scaffold in 1683, executed by the English government for sedition. Names like Algernon Sidney may be unknown today, but they were revered by 18th century Americans. The last will and testament of Josiah Quincy demonstrates how our revolutionary forefathers wished to pass on their intellectual heritage to future generations.
I leave to my son, when he shall have reached the age of 15, the works of Algernon Sidney, John Locke, Bacon, Gordon's Tacitus, and Cato's letters. May the spirit of liberty rest upon him.
In 1825, Jefferson urged the Board of Visitors of the University of Virginia to acknowledge those books on which the American Republic was founded.
Resolve that it is the opinion of this board that as to the general principles of liberty and the rights of man in nature and in society, the doctrines of Locke in his essay concerning the true original extent and end of civil government, and of Sidney in his discourses on government, may be considered as those generally approved by our fellow citizens of Virginia and the United States.
If you were to read Locke or Sidney today, you might find them dry and dull, and you might wonder how earlier generations could get so excited about them. You should understand that these writers vigorously defend the right, and in Sidney's case, the duty, to revolt against tyrannical governments. The abstract theories of Locke and Sidney have dramatic effects when applied to the real world. The danger of Sidney's discourses concerning government was summarized by Judge Jeffreys during the Sidney trial for sedition in 1683.
This book contains all the malice and revenge and treason that mankind can be guilty of. It fixes the sole power in the Parliament and the people. The king, it says, is responsible to them. The king is but their trustee. That he had betrayed his trust, he had misgoverned, and now he is to give up, that they might all be kings themselves. Gentlemen, I must tell you I think I ought more than ordinarily to press this upon you, because I know the misfortune of the late unhappy rebellion, and the bringing of the late blessed king to the scaffold was begun by such kind of principles.
Thomas Jefferson admired the works of John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and other Whig writers. We should mention, however, that modern scholars do not follow Jefferson in referring to this simply as the Whig tradition. To do so would confuse radicals like Locke and Sidney with more conservative thinkers who call themselves Whigs. Consequently, Jefferson's way of thinking is sometimes called the true Whig or the radical Whig philosophy. Jefferson believed that many Americans embraced true Whig ideology, and he wished the Declaration to express this general point of view.
This was the object of the Declaration of Independence, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc.
An essential part of this radical Whig tradition was its defense of the right of revolution. The Declaration of Independence, remember, is nothing less than a justification of revolution against an established government. The signers of the Declaration knew they might share the disastrous fate of Algernon Sidney. John Locke discusses the right of revolution in his second treatise, and the influence of this treatment on Jefferson is unmistakable. Even Jefferson's choice of words often reflects the work by Locke, written a century before. To illustrate this point, we shall compare a few passages from the Declaration with similar passages from John Locke. Here is Jefferson.
Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
And here is Locke.
When the government is dissolved, the people are at liberty to provide for themselves, by erecting a new legislative, differing from the other, by the change of persons, or form, or both, as they shall find it most for their safety and good.
Here again is Jefferson.
Mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
And here again is Locke.
People are more disposed to suffer than right themselves by resistance.
Here is Jefferson.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
And here is Locke.
But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, 'tis not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected.
We can see that Jefferson was influenced by John Locke's theory of revolution. But neither Locke nor Jefferson regarded the right of revolution as a primary principle. It was based on and presupposed the concepts of natural rights and social contract. Jefferson and other radical Whigs believed that human beings have natural rights. Natural rights are rights we are born with, rights we enjoy in virtue of our nature as human beings. These rights do not rely for their validity on any person or government, and no person or government can legitimately violate them or take them from us. Natural rights seem so obvious to many 18th century Americans that the Declaration calls them self-evident.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
You may have noticed that although we usually say inalienable rights spelled with an I, the Declaration speaks of unalienable rights spelled with a U. Does this difference reflect a subtle change in meaning? Most likely not. It probably reflects what we call today a typographical error. Jefferson used the word inalienable in his original draft. Where and how the I became a U is anyone's guess. If men are born with equal rights, then how do some men acquire legitimate political power over other men? Jefferson says that individuals put themselves under government voluntarily in order to secure their rights. This is the classic justification of government known as the social contract, and it defines the limits beyond which government may not cross.
That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
If the protection of rights is the proper function of government, then what happens if a government oversteps this line? Jefferson says that if a government oversteps far enough and often enough, that is, if it becomes oppressive, then that government may be abolished and a new government put in its place. Notice how Jefferson defends the right of revolution against any form of government, so long as that government has sufficiently degenerated into tyranny.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
This was the right of revolution championed by Jefferson and other radical Whigs. Having inspired the American Revolution and later the French Revolution, this was the revolutionary doctrine of the 18th century. This was the doctrine condemned vehemently by its opponents as the road to anarchy. Although radical Whigs defended revolution, they by no means defended it without qualification. They did not approve of indiscriminate revolution. They insisted that preconditions must be satisfied before revolution is called for. No government is perfect, so there would be perpetual turmoil if revolutions broke out at the slightest injustice. Isolated cases of oppression might justify resistance, but they cannot justify revolution. The rule of thumb here is that revolutions should not create more evils than they remedy.
Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
The abstract right of revolution is clear, but to apply this principle to the real world requires great care. Of capital importance to the radical Whigs was the presence of a conspiracy by government to subvert human liberty. Unrelated acts of injustice were not enough. These acts must link together in a causal chain, thereby providing evidence of a plan. The established government must exhibit a design, a purposely thought-out series of events to establish tyranny. Only after this pattern of injustice becomes evident to enough people can a revolution be justified in self-defense.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Jefferson set out to prove that George III was guilty of a conspiracy to subvert the liberties of America. He wished to show that aggressive acts by the English government were not unrelated incidents. When colonial grievances dating from 1763 were placed in a larger picture and linked together, Jefferson believed they uncovered a diabolical march to tyranny.
Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
And so Jefferson presented his allegations against George III. As we said before, these were not offered as a grab bag of unrelated crimes. Their persistence and sheer numbers would, Jefferson hoped, provide conclusive evidence of a tyrannical plan to enslave America. Some historians dismissed Jefferson's argument out of hand. George III, they say, had his faults, but he was no tyrant. In their opinion, Jefferson's charge of tyranny was politically motivated propaganda. Before dismissing Jefferson as a political hack, however, we should try to understand his use of words. Two important words appear in the Declaration: usurpation and tyranny. Jefferson uses these words with different meanings. He refers to a long train of abuses and usurpations leading to despotism, and he goes on to use usurpation and tyranny in the same sentence.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states.
Repeated usurpations, Jefferson says, indicate a plan to establish tyranny. This suggests that tyranny is worse than usurpation. It is a more serious kind of oppression. Now, we don't use the words tyranny and usurpation much anymore, but they were common in Jefferson's time. Significantly, Jefferson means different things by them, but nowhere, in or out of the Declaration, does he explain this difference. This suggests that Jefferson assumed his audience would know the difference. Where would they have learned such a thing? Perhaps in a book known to most educated readers of Jefferson's day, a book we cited previously to show its impact on Jefferson's thinking. This book is John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Recall that Jefferson's treatment of revolution drew heavily from John Locke. The passages we quoted from Locke's Second Treatise, passages Jefferson undoubtedly read, are located near Locke's discussion of tyranny. Locke uses the word tyranny with a specific meaning. And, as you may have guessed, Locke contrasts the meaning of tyranny with the meaning of usurpation. Here is the key passage from Locke. It is brief, and its meaning is not obvious. For this reason we shall repeat the passage later.
As usurpation is the exercise of power which another hath a right to, so tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to.
Locke's distinction is difficult to understand, because it depends on a theory of rights. So let's take a quick look at his approach to rights, and then return to his passage about tyranny. John Locke, like Jefferson and others in their tradition, believed in two kinds of rights: alienable rights and inalienable rights. What are alienable rights? They are rights that can be abandoned or transferred. When you sell your car, for example, you transferred the title of ownership to another person. This means the right to your car was alienable. You had the power, with your consent, of abandoning or transferring the title to your car. What are inalienable rights? They are rights that cannot be abandoned or transferred under any circumstances. Radical Whigs generally accepted the rights to life and liberty as inalienable rights. You cannot, according to their theory, transfer the title to your life and liberty as you would transfer the title to your car. You cannot sell yourself into slavery. And this holds true whether or not you consent, because there is no title to life and liberty that is even capable of transfer. Inalienable rights derive from your nature as a human being, and they cannot be separated from it. The distinction between alienable rights and inalienable rights was very important for philosophers who believed that a social contract bound a person to his government. They believed that a person surrendered some rights to government in exchange for the government's protection of other rights. For example, a person was said to surrender the right to a minimal amount of alienable property, collected as taxes, which the government required for its expenses. Now, this supposed agreement between the people and government never actually happened, and most social contract philosophers knew it. They did not believe in a real agreement located somewhere in the past, or more precisely, they did not believe in the historical reality of an explicit agreement based on the explicit consent of every person. To get their social contract off the ground, these philosophers appealed to what they called implied or tacit consent. This is the kind of agreement you give to pay your bill at a restaurant, for example, without stating beforehand your agreement to pay the bill. Your consent is seen as implicit in your actions. This raises a serious problem. If a social contract is implied by our actions, if the exact terms of the social contract are unstated and uncertain, then how can we know if a government violates its part of the agreement? Even an oppressive government can fall back on the social contract. Even an oppressive government can say its actions do not violate rights because the rights in question were surrendered as part of the social contract. This uncertainty creates a sticky problem for the social contract argument. The social contract, it seems, instead of justifying revolution, will always condemn it. This is inevitable if no limit is set on the rights supposedly surrendered or transferred to government in the unwritten and undefined social contract. The social contract advocates replied with an appeal to inalienable rights. These rights are impossible to surrender or transfer. Clearly, then, the previous excuse used by governments will never work with inalienable rights. We know inalienable rights were never transferred to any government in the social contract, because they never can be transferred to anyone at any time under any circumstances. Inalienable rights stand outside any social contract, real or imaginary. They establish an inflexible barrier beyond which no government may pass. With this background, listen once more to Locke's definition of tyranny.
As usurpation is the exercise of power, which another hath a right to, so tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to.
Locke's distinction should now be clear. Usurpation refers to violating alienable rights. Tyranny refers to violating inalienable rights. Stealing a car is usurpation. Enslaving a man is tyranny. If Jefferson was familiar with Locke's definition of tyranny, and it seems certain he was, then Jefferson's reasoning in the Declaration becomes more understandable. Jefferson's overriding purpose in the Declaration was to convict the king of tyranny. So how did Jefferson begin? Logically enough, with a list of inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the rights which, if violated by the king, would make him a tyrant. Jefferson knew what he was doing. American colonists had complained for years about the usurpations of the English Parliament and later the English king. Jefferson himself accused Parliament and king of usurpation in his 1774 pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. So long as the complaints went no further than usurpation, however, the colonists were in the same dilemma we discussed earlier. The rights they complained about were alienable rights, so who was to say whether or not these rights were surrendered in a mythical social contract? One thing was certain. No revolution would ever get off the philosophic starting blocks in the midst of this confusion. If Jefferson was to justify revolution, he had to convict George III of violating not just any rights, but of violating inalienable rights. This was necessary for two reasons. First, there was no possible excuse for a systematic violation of inalienable rights. The argument quoted earlier from the loyalist Peter von Schaack, which said Americans should give England the benefit of the doubt, might work with alienable rights, but not with inalienable rights. Neither the Parliament nor the king could deceive themselves into thinking that inalienable rights had somehow been surrendered by Americans in a social contract or by any other means. No, only one possible motive explained the repeated violation of inalienable rights: a deliberate plan to establish tyranny. Second, if the king could be proved guilty of violating inalienable rights, then the charge of tyranny, as defined by Locke, would stick. And when usurpation turns into tyranny, resistance can legitimately turn into revolution. When we focus on Jefferson's charge of tyranny against George III, and when we realize that tyranny was defined as the violation of inalienable rights, the Declaration of Independence appears as a systematic and tightly argued document. Listen to the second paragraph once again, but this time hear it as a contemporary of Jefferson would have heard it. Listen as one who advocates the right of revolution, but only if a conspiracy to establish tyranny is proven against the king. That is, only if enough evidence is presented to show the purposeful violation of inalienable rights.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
Throughout his eventful life, Thomas Jefferson regarded the Declaration of Independence as one of his greatest achievements. In 1826, Jefferson wrote his own epitaph. The Declaration was one of the 3 accomplishments he wished to be remembered for.
Could the dead feel any interest in monuments or other remembrances of them, the following would be to me the most gratifying. The following inscription and not a word more. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Because by these, as testimonials that I have lived, I wish most to be remembered.
If you enjoyed this discussion, you will probably enjoy other products of the Cato Institute, including tapes of policy forums, monographs, books, and publications. For more information on the Cato Institute, write to Cato Institute, 1000 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20001, or call 202-842-0200. For a catalog of Cato publications, call toll-free 1-800-767-1241, or visit our site on the World Wide Web at http://www.cato.org. We hope that you have enjoyed this presentation of the Cato University, a project of the Cato Institute.